St Mark's was built by the 7th Earl of Stamford way back in 1856, and you may notice that this church doesn't have a churchyard. However, just across the road lays the churchyard that also contains burials of 2 Quakers and the Lords of Stamford. Here on History Walks we've often covered larger, more archaic churches, but just for today I decided to come down here and take a look at a small country, rural church. Beautifully laid out in a traditional style, St Mark's is surrounded by open countryside and fields growing a wide selection of crops. Now St Mark's serves a small community, but don't be fooled by the name of Dunham Town. Dunham is a small, quaint village in the heart of Cheshire.
Te corda nostra somnient, te perso porem sentiant, tuamque semper gloriam, vicina luce concina.
Some 800 years ago, the monks of St Werburgh's Abbey decided to build a church here in Prestbury in Cheshire. But to do this, they had to demolish an Anglo-Saxon church which already stood on the site. Why did the monks of St Werburgh's Abbey demolish and destroy such an ancient building, and what did they design for themselves? Welcome to History Walks. There's compelling evidence that a church stood on this site way back in Anglo-Saxon times. After the Norman conquest of England, a second church built on this site came into the hands of one Baron Hugh Cyfeilioc. He was a very powerful baron, and he gifted the church to the Abbey of St Werburgh in or around the year of 1173. Once in the hands of the St Werburgh monks, it was decided to demolish the Anglo-Saxon church. However, they replaced it with what we know today as a Norman chapel. The work on the chapel was completed in 1195. Here in the quiet village of Thelwall in Cheshire once stood an ancient chapel, a chapel that was built in 1663 by a Mr. Richard Brooke. But in 1663 a legal suit was issued between the chapel here at Thelwall and the church at Daresbury. It was actually believed at that time that the chapel here at Thelwall was much older than 1663. The dispute was settled in the August of 1663, by which time the church wardens of nearby Daresbury accepted the sum of 24 shillings yearly from the inhabitants of Thelwall to discharge all future repairs to the mother church at Runcorn or the chapel at Daresbury. In 1663 the chapel was once again restored and a minister installed. However, in 3 years, in 1666, he died and the chapel fell into a state of disrepair once again. It wasn't until 1731 that an effort was made to obtain help for the chapel from Queen Anne's bounty. Though successful, it wasn't until 1782, when commissioners were appointed by the Bishop of Chester, that it was repaired and refitted. In the 13th century, to the north of Mobley in Cheshire, a church was built to meet the religious needs of the people. In 1888, whilst the church was undergoing restoration, a Saxon church was found directly below. Welcome to History Walks. The earliest written evidence for a church on this site dates right back to 1206 AD, when Patrick de Moberly formed an Augustinian priory. However, the priory was short-lived, and in 1240 it was annexed to Rochester in the county of Staffordshire. The earliest part of this church today dates right back to 1245, and in the 13th century it consisted of a nave and chancel all under one roof. As well as having a detached separate tower, in the year 1450 it was further expanded with the addition of a new roof and the expansion of the aisles. By 1533 the tower was completely replaced as the old tower had become unsafe. In 1888 the chancel was largely rebuilt. The church itself had a long association with the Mallory family. Here, just off the busy A49 in Winwick in Warrington, that we find ourselves in the grounds of the archaic church of St Oswald's. My name's James Baum, history columnist for Cheshire Life, and welcome to History Walks. Now, the church of St Oswald stands here in the village of Winwick in Cheshire, and believe me, it's on the National Registers for England. It's also a Grade 1 listed building. The fact that the church has stood here since ancient times has been recorded in the Domesday Book, and the earliest parts of St Oswald's date right back to the 13th century. village of Asbury near Congleton is one of the 8 ancient parishes in the Macclesfield Hundred until 1835, when it became part of the municipal borough. Today, History Walks has come here to St Mary's Church in Asbury to take a look at the ancient tombstones and the medieval carvings. This place certainly has a history to tell. Welcome to History Walks. The origins of St Mary's is quite unclear, but in the Domesday Book of 1086 it was mentioned that a priest was resident here in Asbury. However, there was no mention of a church. The later discovery of stone fragments with possible Saxon carvings and coffin lids, as well as a base from an ancient stone cross, were found here, indicating that there was probably an earlier Saxon church somewhere nearby. Here to the east of the village of Lymm in Cheshire stands St Peter's Church in Outrington. Measuring 106 feet long and 54 feet high, it also boasts a magnificent spire standing some 106 feet tall. Built between 1871 to 1872 out of grey sandstone, this church is literally outstanding in its field. Welcome to History Walks. Not only will we be taking a look around the churchyard of St Peter's today, but I'll be taking you up in the air to give you a bird's eye view of the structure itself. On the 14th of June 1982, the building was designated as a Grade 2 listed building, offering it the protection that it richly deserved. is known about the early history of St Mary's Church here in Rostherne. Indeed, it didn't even get a mention in the Domesday books. But a deed dated to 1188 AD states at that time that there was a church stood on this site. The tower that we see today was built in 1742 to 1744 and was designed by architect John Rowson. The chancel and north vestry were redesigned in 1888 by Sir Arthur Bloomfield, and indeed the porch we see today was redesigned for 1886. The lynch gate that we see today was constructed in 1640, which is considered to be one of the best examples in Cheshire. It has a self-closing mechanism designed to keep the animals out of the graveyard. St Mary's Church is constructed in a Gothic neoclassical style and is listed as a Grade 1 listed building, built of sandstone with a lead and slate roof. Now here, near to the entrance of the church, stands the remains of a stone-carved sundial dated to around about 1730. But what makes this one so special is it's actually Grade 2 listed. Here in the leafy village of Gawsworth, we've come to see St James's Church, a church dating back to the 15th century. The picturesque church of St James stands on high ground overlooking the medieval manor of Gawsworth Hall. Now we know that the Church of St James stands on an earlier site where we know for a fact that was once a Norman chapel. Now, one of the things that St James's is famous for here in Gawsworth is the medieval stone carvings of the grotesques and the gargoyles. Now, there's no doubt that these carvings are some of the best I've seen in Cheshire, and they really embellish the church and make it even more interesting. Now, here in St James's churchyard stands a medieval preaching cross, one of a few across Cheshire, and it's ornately decorated with mythical beasts and dragons. Here in the Cheshire village of Wimbury stands a tower, the Leaning Tower, and dating back to the 15th century. Well, clearly this is a church tower, but the question remains, where's the church? History tells us that there have been 5 churches on this site, one after another, and every single one demolished from 1595 to 1977. Whilst there have been many churches on this site, unfortunately every one began to sink into the ground and had to be demolished. However, we still have that tower to remind us of the 15th century. Here in the village of Farndon on the English-Welsh border stands the church of St Chad. St Chad was the first bishop of the Mercians. In the year 672 AD, St Chad died, but his name lived on for centuries to come. Welcome to History Walks. This church has a very long and dramatic history, and it's believed that wooden structures stood on here from the earliest times, indeed from Celtic times. The Domesday Book records that there was a priest present in this village. However, it also recorded there were two wealthy priests who were landowners in the area. The outline of the church that we see today is predominantly attributed to the 14th century, as is the magnificent tower. This was also the time that a bridge was constructed to cross the nearby River Dee. St Michael's Church here in Marbury, Cheshire stands on a slight rise and it overlooks what is known as the Big Mere. We know that in the year of 1299 AD, a timber wattle and daub church stood on this site. However, in the 15th century, a stone church was built. Welcome to History Walks. St Michael's stands here in an idyllic landscape on the Cheshire-Shropshire border. A schoolhouse also once stood here in the churchyard as far back as 1688, only to be demolished in 1824. The walls carved from local sandstone surround the church and date back as far as the 16th century.